Imagine waking up on a cold marble floor. The air smells of sweat and smoke from last night's fire. You're not in your home. You haven't had one in years. Chains clink softly as you shift your aching body. A voice calls your name, not with kindness, but with command. You rise quickly because hesitation means pain. You learned that lesson the hard way. Your name isn't really yours anymore. In the house of your master, your property. No rights, no choices, just an object to be used, sold, or punished. You hurry to the atrium, barefoot on the stone. Your dress is a rough scrap of cloth, barely covering you from the stairs that linger too long. Today's duties? They never end. Prepare the baths, scrub the floors, serve the wine, and when the sun goes down, you'll pray, quietly, desperately, that the master doesn't summon you to his bed. Because in this house, consent doesn't exist. This isn't a nightmare. It's reality for thousands of women in ancient Rome. Women who were captured in war, sold in markets, or even born into chains. In a city celebrated for law, architecture, and philosophy, there existed a world where a woman's body wasn't her own, and her life could be taken without consequence. What made it worse? It wasn't hidden. It was normal. Society looked the other way because slaves weren't people. They were property, protected by the full force of Roman law, but only for their owner's benefit. A law called ius vitae necisque gave masters the ultimate power, the right of life and death over their slaves. Think about that for a moment. Your survival depends entirely on someone else's whim. And this wasn't just about hard labor. For female slaves, the chains weren't only on their wrists, they were on their bodies, their dignity, their very existence. They cooked and cleaned by day and endured unspeakable violations by night. Their suffering was a silent foundation for Rome's grandeur. But here's the question: how did this become acceptable? How did one of history's most celebrated civilizations justify such cruelty? We're about to pull back the curtain on a side of Rome you won't find in the glorified marble statues and history textbooks. The lives of women who were bought, sold, and broken, and the empire that depended on them, because their story matters. And once you hear what they endured, you'll never look at ancient Rome the same way again. Rome. The name alone carries weight. We imagine grand marble temples, mighty legions, and emperors draped in gold. It's the empire that shaped law, language, and architecture for centuries. But behind the shimmering facade of glory was a system built on human suffering, especially the suffering of women no one talks about. Why should we care? Because history isn't just about victories and monuments. It's about the cost of those achievements. And that cost was paid in flesh, in silence, and in lives erased from the record. Ancient Rome prided itself on order and civilization. But the truth is uncomfortable. Slavery wasn't an exception. It was the foundation. At its height, nearly 1 in 3 people in Rome was enslaved, and think about that. Every feast in a senator's villa, every soldier's triumphal parade, every luxurious Roman bath was supported by hands that were chained, and among those millions, women bore the heaviest burden. Not only were they forced into relentless labor, they were also reduced to something even more degrading. A body for rent, a vessel for profit, a possession that could be violated without consequence. You won't find this in the glorified tales of Rome's greatness, because history prefers its heroes clean, its empires noble. But the truth? The empire's strength depended on crushing the weak, and these women were the easiest to break. Why does this matter now? Because the echoes are still with us. Human trafficking, sexual slavery, power used as a weapon against the vulnerable. The world has changed, but the pattern hasn't. When you strip away the marble columns and Latin inscriptions, the story feels disturbingly familiar. So, as we dive deeper, remember this isn't just about the past. It's about power, control, and what happens when a society decides some lives matter less than others. It's about how cruelty hides behind culture, and how easy it is to accept the unacceptable when it benefits the powerful. Ready to hear the truth? Then let's start at the beginning. How did these women end up in chains in the first place? How does a woman become a slave in ancient Rome? There was no single path. For some, it started with war. Rome's armies swept across continents: Greece, Gaul, North Africa, the Middle East, and every victory meant human spoils. Entire villages were emptied, families torn apart. Women and children marched in chains behind triumphant legions, destined for the slave markets of Rome. Others fell into bondage through debt. A father unable to pay what he owed could sell his own daughter to survive. Imagine that moment, the choice between starvation and surrendering your child to a lifetime of servitude. In Roman law, that wasn't considered cruelty, it was business. And then there were those who never had a choice at all, children born to enslaved mothers. From their first breath, they belonged to someone else. No hope of freedom, no path to citizenship, just a life measured in what they could provide for their owner. Slavery wasn't rare, it wasn't hidden, it was everywhere. By some estimates, 2 million slaves lived under Roman rule at its height, and women were considered the most valuable for reasons that had nothing to do with strength or skill. They were objects, tools for work, and far too often, vessels for pleasure. The Roman elite treated human life like currency. Markets overflowed with bodies, each priced according to youth, beauty, and obedience. Auction blocks displayed women as if they were merchandise, naked, examined, prodded by strangers deciding what they were worth. And what did freedom look like? For most, it didn't exist. Manumission, the act of freeing a slave, was possible, but rare. And for women, even freedom didn't erase the scars. Many who were freed had spent decades as property, enduring things they could never speak of without fear. But for those who remained, life was an unending chain of commands. And the first lesson every enslaved woman learned was simple: your body does not belong to you. Because what came next wasn't just labor, it was something far darker, something that Roman law didn't just allow, but encouraged. In Rome, a female slave wasn't just a servant, she was an investment. And her body? That was part of the bargain. Roman law made one thing painfully clear: slaves were property. They could be bought, sold, beaten, or worse, without consequence. And for women, this meant something far more sinister than hard labor. It meant their bodies were not their own. The legal concept, ius vitae nescisc, the right of life and death, gave masters absolute power. Imagine what that meant behind closed doors. There were no courts, no protection, no one to stop the owner from doing whatever he wanted. Consent didn't exist. Sexual exploitation wasn't whispered about in Rome. It was expected. Female slaves were often kept as concubinae, unofficial concubines who existed solely to satisfy their master's desires. Some were forced into prostitution, not just in brothels but in private rooms, rented out for profit like livestock. And the cruelty went beyond the physical. These women lived in constant fear because their worth wasn't measured in humanity. It was measured in obedience. A master could punish rejection or even hesitation with lashes, starvation, or branding. Some were marked permanently on the forehead with the letter F for fugitiva, runaway. So everyone would know they'd tried to escape. The historian Seneca once wrote about the casualness of this violence, describing how masters treated human beings as if they were disposable tools. If a slave aged, became ill, or lost their beauty, they were cast aside or worse. And if a child was born from these forced encounters, it wasn't seen as a scandal, it was a bonus. Another slave added to the household inventory. Think about that for a moment. A woman's suffering became a source of profit. Her body, her motherhood, even her future were all commodities traded in Rome's thriving economy. This was more than control, it was complete dehumanization, a system where intimacy was stripped of meaning and turned into a transaction. But if you think this was the end of their misery, you're wrong. Because after the violations came the work, endless, back-breaking labor that crushed the body and the spirit alike. After the humiliation came the grind. For a female slave in Rome, there was no such thing as rest. From the first light of dawn, her day began with orders, and it didn't end until her body collapsed from exhaustion. Inside wealthy villas, she scrubbed marble floors until her hands bled. She fetched water, prepared lavish feasts, and endured the sharp tongue of her mistress. Because cruelty wasn't limited to men, female owners often lashed out, jealous or bitter. reminding the slave of her place with every cutting word or sudden slap. But domestic chores were only part of the burden. Many women were forced into textile work, spinning wool for hours on end, their fingers raw from the constant pull of coarse fibers. Others were sent to the baths to tend strangers or to the bustling markets as vendors, always working, always under watch. And for the poorest households, the duties were harsher still. Some women labored in fields under the burning sun, bending their bodies until every muscle screamed. Others were rented out by their masters for a daily fee, sent to kitchens, taverns, or even brothels, turned into nothing more than a source of income. There was no mercy for mistakes. Drop a jug of wine, expect lashes, speak out of turn, beaten, try to escape, branding, mutilation, or worse. Roman punishments were as brutal as they were creative. Some slaves were chained to the door as living guard dogs. Others were paraded in iron collars with inscriptions reading, "Stop me, I am a runaway." Every day was a battle to survive, not just the work, but the crushing knowledge that there was no way out. Imagine living a life where every sound, a door creaking open, footsteps approaching, could mean punishment, humiliation, or death. And yet, even in this darkness, some women dared to resist. They whispered plans, hid scraps of food, or ran for the gates under cover of night. But rebellion came with a price so terrifying it kept most chained in silence. Because when a female slave defied her master, Rome answered with blood. What happened when a slave refused, when she said no one cheek, when she fought back or even tried to run? In Rome, the answer was clear: terror. Rebellion wasn't just punished, it was crushed so brutally that it served as a warning to everyone else. A female slave who resisted her master's will, whether in labor or in bed, invited a storm of violence. The first response was almost always the whip. Roman scourges weren't simple leather straps. They were instruments of agony, sometimes tipped with bone or metal. A single beating could tear flesh down to the bone, and this wasn't done in secret. Punishment was a spectacle, a lesson for others. Submit or suffer the same fate. Branding was another favorite method. A runaway might be marked forever with an iron brand on the forehead, an inescapable scar of shame. Some were fitted with heavy iron collars, engraved with phrases like, "I belong to my master. If you find me, return me." Imagine the weight of that, both on the neck and on the soul. But the violence didn't stop there. For the most defiant, mutilation was an option. Ears cut, tendons severed, faces disfigured. In the eyes of Roman law, this wasn't cruelty, it was control. And then there was death. Execution was legal, swift, and often public. Crucifixion, Rome's most infamous punishment, wasn't reserved for criminals alone. Slaves who killed their masters or were even suspected of conspiring could be nailed to a cross as a grim warning. One chilling case in 61 BCE tells the story of Pedanius Secundus, a Roman noble killed by a slave. The law demanded every slave in his household, 400 of them, be executed. Men, women, even children. And they were. For female slaves, the terror was compounded by humiliation. Some were stripped naked and paraded before crowds before being beaten or killed. The goal wasn't just to end a life, it was to erase dignity. To send a message so powerful that rebellion would die in the mind before it reached the body. So most women didn't fight, not because they lacked courage, but because Rome left them no hope. Survival meant obedience. But even obedience wasn't enough to shield them from the next cruel twist of fate, motherhood. Because in Rome, even giving life was a weapon turned against them. In a world where a woman owned nothing, not even her body, motherhood became another tool of control. For female slaves in Rome, pregnancy didn't bring joy, it brought fear. A child didn't mean family, it meant property. Under Roman law, a child born to an enslaved woman belonged to her master, automatically and completely. From the moment the baby took its first breath, it was an asset in someone else's ledger. Some masters encouraged pregnancies not out of compassion, but profit. Every child was a future worker, a new body to replace those broken by age or labor. Women were pushed to bear children, sometimes against their will, because their fertility was as valuable as their hands. But there was no promise of stability. Families didn't exist in slavery, they existed on borrowed time. At any moment, a child could be sold, a mother separated forever. Imagine holding your newborn, knowing he isn't yours. Imagine feeding him, rocking him to sleep, while fearing the sound of footsteps, because that could mean he's gone by morning. Some women fought back the only way they could. Ancient sources hint at desperate acts, mothers ending pregnancies, even their own lives, rather than see their children chained. But many endured, hoping for a miracle that rarely came. Because in Rome, even the purest bond, mother and child, was poisoned by the chains of slavery. And yet, this nightmare wasn't confined to the ancient world, because the shadow of Rome stretches further than you think. You might be wondering, why dwell on this cruelty? Because it never truly ended. The systems have changed, the faces are different, but the patterns remain. Today, an estimated 50 million people worldwide live in conditions of modern slavery. In sweatshops, in forced marriages, in brothels. Women and girls make up the vast majority of those trafficked for sex and labor. Sound familiar? The language is modern, but the logic is ancient. Power exploiting vulnerability. Human beings reduced to profit. Consent erased. Families torn apart. It's the same story, written in different ink. The Romans believed slavery was natural, that some people were born to rule and others to serve. That same dangerous idea lingers in every system that values profit over people. When you read about supply chains tainted by forced labor or hear of women sold into trafficking rings, you're staring into a mirror held up by history. Rome may have fallen, but the mentality that built it, the hunger for control, the comfort built on someone else's suffering, still walks among us. Which leaves us with a question we can't ignore. What does it really mean to be civilized? Rome is remembered as a beacon of progress, law, architecture, art. But peel back the marble and you find the truth. An empire that rose on broken backs, on silenced screams, on lives reduced to property. It forces us to ask, has the world truly changed? Or have we just given old chains new names? Every time power goes unchecked, every time a life is measured in profit, every time we turn away from suffering because it benefits us, we walk the same path Rome did. And history is clear about where that path leads. Civilizations don't fall because of barbarians at the gate. They fall from rot within, from forgetting the humanity of those they exploit. Rome's greatest flaw wasn't its ambition, it was its indifference to the suffering that fueled its glory. So when you look at the ruins, remember this. Behind every stone was a human story. And some of the darkest belonged to women whose names were never written, whose pain was never spoken. But their silence is a warning, echoing across centuries. Power without mercy turns progress into cruelty. And maybe the real question isn't what Rome was, it's what we are becoming.